A father and son vanished deep inside Yellowstone National Park. No calls, no tracks, just silence. For 12 years, there were no answers. Then, tourists stumbled upon something that would change everything. What started as a simple weekend trip would soon become one of the most baffling mysteries ever recorded in America's first national park. And the story of what happened in those woods would haunt everyone who heard it. Yellowstone is breathtaking. Sprawling valleys, steaming geysers, rivers cutting through canyons carved by time itself. But beneath the postcard, beauty lies danger. The earth here shifts and breathes, releasing boiling water through hidden vents. One wrong step and the ground can collapse beneath you, exposing pools hot enough to strip flesh from bone. Wolves roam the forests, grizzly bears stalk the meadows, and storms roll in without warning. It is as unforgiving as it is beautiful. On a warm July morning in 2009, a mid-sized SUV pulled into the trailhead parking lot at Yellowstone's southern boundary. Inside were two travelers who believed they were heading toward a weekend of adventure, a father and his teenage son. They signed their names in the backcountry logbook. Their destination was scrawled with confidence: Snake River Trail. Fishing. It should have been an easy trip. A couple of nights under the stars, maybe a few stories shared over a campfire, but they would never return. When rangers later checked the trailhead, the vehicle was still there, dust gathering on the windshield. The pair had never checked back out. No footprints, no gear, no sign of where they had gone. Their campsite remained empty, the riverbank silent. The park swallowed them whole, leaving behind only questions. The search began immediately. Dozens of rangers swept the trails. Helicopters scanned the valleys. Dogs picked up faint traces, only to lose them hours later in tangled brush. But nothing concrete ever surfaced. It was as though the earth itself had decided to keep them. For years, the case became another whisper among Yellowstone's dark legends, one of many names etched into the park's long history of disappearances. Until, 12 years later, hikers stumbled across something hidden far off the marked trails, something that would reignite the case and reveal details no one was prepared for. The father was 46 years old, a man who loved the outdoors but never claimed to be an expert. His name was Daniel Hayes. He worked long hours as a civil engineer back in Colorado, a steady job that left him with little time for anything beyond blueprints and deadlines. But this trip wasn't about work. It was about reconnecting with his only son. Daniel had grown up camping with his own father, and he wanted to pass down that tradition. He wasn't a reckless man. He'd studied the maps, packed carefully, and reassured his family that they would be back in just a few days. Beside him was 15-year-old Ethan. He had his father's sharp features and the restless energy of someone caught between boyhood and adulthood. Ethan wasn't thrilled at first about spending a weekend in the wilderness, away from his phone, his friends, and the comfort of suburban life. But he knew how much it meant to his dad, so he went along, backpack strapped tight, trying to mask the nervous excitement in his eyes. They planned it carefully, hike a section of the Snake River Trail, set up camp near one of the river bends, spend the afternoons fishing, and the evenings by a fire. Yellowstone's backcountry permits allowed them to roam deeper than most tourists ever dared. The park was crowded that summer, but the route they chose promised solitude, just the two of them against the vast expanse of America's wild heart. Daniel carried the heavier load: tent, stove, extra food. Ethan carried his fishing gear and a small journal his mother had slipped into his pack, telling him to write about the trip. They set out that morning with light in their eyes, walking confidently into one of the most rugged landscapes in the country. Other hikers who passed them later recalled nothing unusual: a father pointing out birds to his son, the boy trailing a step behind, both of them smiling. The weather was clear, the skies wide and blue. They stopped for lunch on a ridge overlooking the valley. Daniel promised this was only the beginning, that they'd make memories they'd talk about for years. Ethan laughed, saying he hoped that included catching a fish bigger than his dad's. It was a moment frozen in time, simple, joyful, and unaware of the shadow that was about to fall over them. Because after that day, neither Daniel nor Ethan Hayes would ever be seen alive again. Yellowstone is unlike anywhere else on Earth. It is a land alive, breathing through its geysers and steaming vents, hiding rivers of molten rock beneath the crust. The beauty here is undeniable. Towering pines, wide meadows painted gold by wildflowers, bison moving like shadows across the plains. But it is also a place of danger. The ground itself can kill. Pools look inviting until you realize they are near boiling. Grizzlies roam the backcountry with silent power. Storms roll in without warning, turning clear skies into blinding sheets of rain and lightning. For Daniel and Ethan, this was the adventure. They stocked up in the nearby town of Jackson Hole, dried food, propane, and a couple of new fishing lures. Locals remembered them as polite, excited, a little out of their element, but full of anticipation. Daniel asked a clerk about road conditions and smiled when she told him it should be fine. He'd planned the trip with care, double-checked the maps, and told Ethan they'd be back in plenty of time for school. On July 11, 2009, they drove into the park through the south entrance. At the Snake River trailhead, they signed their names in the backcountry logbook. The writing was neat, confident. Daniel and Ethan Hayes, 2 nights. The park ranger on duty remembered seeing them head out, Daniel adjusting his son's pack before they stepped onto the trail. It was early afternoon, the sun cutting through the trees. The kind of day that makes you believe the wilderness will welcome you. That entry in the logbook would be the last official record of their lives. Beyond that trailhead, they slipped into Yellowstone's endless wilderness. The park is over 2 million acres, larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined. Once you step off the main paths, it becomes a labyrinth of valleys, rivers, and forests where a person can disappear in seconds. And that is exactly what happened. The plan was simple: 2 nights out, back by the evening of July 13th. When they didn't return, no one panicked at first. Hikers are often late, delayed by weather, or an extra day of exploring. But as hours turned into a full day, with no word, the concern grew. By July 15th, their SUV was still sitting at the trailhead, dust gathering on its hood. Inside were a road map, a cooler, and Daniel's sunglasses on the dashboard. The vehicle looked untouched, waiting patiently for an owner who would never come back. Rangers began canvassing the area. They checked the backcountry logbook, confirmed Daniel and Ethan had signed in, but there was no corresponding sign-out. Hikers who had entered the park around the same time were questioned. Some remembered a man and teenager walking with fishing poles. Others weren't sure. None could say where they'd gone after the first few miles. There were no distress calls, no notes left behind, no gear, no footprints that could be tied directly to them. The Snake River corridor is vast, with countless side trails that vanish into thickets of pines and aspen groves. A wrong turn could lead miles off course, but the search dogs picked up nothing solid. The pair seemed to have stepped into thin air. For the Hayes family back in Colorado, the news was devastating. What was supposed to be a weekend of bonding had turned into silence. The official report filed by the Park Service described it bluntly. 2 visitors entered on July 11th. They did not exit. Their vehicle remains at the trailhead. Status unknown. It was as if Yellowstone had closed around them, swallowing both father and son without a trace. That was only the beginning of one of the most haunting disappearances the park had ever seen. When word spread that Daniel and Ethan had failed to return, Yellowstone's rangers moved fast. Missing hikers in the backcountry are treated with urgency. Every hour matters. By dawn on July 16th, the largest search and rescue operation in the park that summer was underway. Helicopters sliced through the morning fog, their rotors echoing across valleys. From above, the searchers scanned meadows, ridgelines, and the Snake River corridor for any flash of color, any sign of a tent or campfire. On the ground, volunteers and seasoned trackers fanned out along the trails. Dog teams sniffed for scents, noses pressed to the earth, handlers urging them on. Horses carried searchers into places too rough for vehicles. Every canyon, every side trail was examined. Radios buzzed constantly with updates. Possible prints here, a scrap of fabric there. Each time, the hope built, only to collapse when the lead evaporated. The terrain made everything harder. Yellowstone isn't gentle. Its forests are dense, its rivers swift and cold. Geysers and boiling pools bubble just feet from hiking paths. A storm swept in on the second day, hammering searchers with rain and lightning that forced helicopters to ground. By nightfall, wet and exhausted, the teams regrouped with nothing to show. In most missing hiker cases, some trace surfaces quickly: an abandoned campsite, a water bottle, footprints in the mud. But with Daniel and Ethan, there was nothing. It was as if they had stepped into a void. Searchers returned day after day, their grid widening further and further until it covered nearly 40 square miles of wilderness. On the fifth day, the search coordinator addressed the gathered teams. "We've covered the most likely routes. At this point, we'd expect some kind of sign, gear, clothing, something. But we have nothing." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm clouds overhead. By the end of the first week, more than 200 people had participated in the search. The results were the same: no campfire ashes, no discarded wrappers, no broken branches suggesting a struggle, just empty forest and the feeling that the park itself was hiding the truth. Daniel and Ethan Hayes had vanished, and no one could explain how. When the searches turned up nothing, theories began to fill the silence. The first and most obvious was wildlife. Yellowstone is home to grizzlies and wolves, predators capable of killing a man in seconds. Could Daniel and Ethan have been attacked on the trail? Yet rangers found no blood, no torn clothing, none of the signs such encounters always leave behind. Others suggested the geothermal pools. Tourists have died after slipping into hidden hot springs, water that looks calm but boils beneath the surface. A fall into one of these pools would leave almost no trace. But the Snake River Trail doesn't run close to such features. For Daniel and Ethan to have encountered one, they would have had to stray far from their planned route. There was also the river itself. The Snake runs cold and fast in July, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. If they'd tried fishing from an unstable bank and slipped in, the current could have dragged them miles downstream. Bodies sometimes disappear into log jams and whirlpools, resurfacing weeks later or never. But even then, searchers scoured the banks for miles. They found nothing. As days stretched into weeks, darker theories emerged. Foul play. Some whispered that the pair might have stumbled into something they weren't supposed to see: illegal hunting, drug activity, or simply the wrong people in the wrong place. Others pointed the finger inward. Perhaps Daniel, under stress, had chosen Yellowstone as the place to stage a disappearance, taking his son with him. The Hayes family refused to believe it. Daniel wasn't running from anything. He'd loved his son too much to vanish on purpose. But the longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to silence those whispers. Every missing person case invites speculation, but this one bred obsession. Online forums buzzed with theories, each more far-fetched than the last. Alien abduction, secret military testing. Even the idea that Yellowstone's ground, so unstable, so unpredictable, had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. No matter the theory, one fact remained: 2 people had entered Yellowstone. And 12 years later, not a single piece of evidence would surface, until the day tourists stumbled into a discovery that reignited the mystery. Back in Colorado, the silence was unbearable. Every ring of the phone carried hope. Every knock on the door could have been the news she prayed for. But it never came. For Daniel's wife and Ethan's mother, Lisa Hayes, giving up was not an option. While rangers scaled back the official search after 2 weeks, Lisa pushed harder. She begged authorities to extend the mission, wrote letters to park officials, even spoke at town halls. "They're still out there," she insisted. "We just haven't looked in the right place." When the National Park Service declined to continue large-scale operations, Lisa turned to private trackers. She scraped together savings, borrowed from family, and brought in survival experts familiar with Yellowstone's unforgiving terrain. They retraced the routes, studied the maps, even analyzed weather reports from the week Daniel and Ethan disappeared. Nothing. Her determination drew media attention. Local newspapers ran headlines about the vanished father and son. Soon, national outlets picked up the story. Family trip ends in silence. Father and son missing in Yellowstone. Cameras followed Lisa as she handed out flyers, her face lined with exhaustion, but lit by fierce resolve. She appeared on morning shows, voice trembling but steady, telling the world about Daniel's laugh, about Ethan's love of baseball, about how they couldn't simply vanish. But time is cruel in missing person cases. After the first few weeks, attention shifted. New stories replaced theirs. Yet Lisa refused to stop. Each summer she returned to Yellowstone on the anniversary of their disappearance. She walked the trails they might have taken, staring into the vast forest, calling their names as if the wilderness might answer. Volunteers joined her at times, strangers drawn by sympathy or curiosity. But with each passing year, the crowds grew smaller. Her persistence bordered on obsession. Friends whispered that she was chasing ghosts, but to Lisa, it wasn't obsession, it was love. "As long as I'm breathing," she told one reporter, "I'll keep looking." "Until someone proves otherwise, my husband and son are still out there." Her words echoed what every parent, every spouse of the missing feels. Hope is the last thing to die. To understand what happened to Daniel and Ethan, you first have to understand Yellowstone itself. It is not just a park. It is a living, shifting force. Beneath its forests and valleys lies one of the largest supervolcanoes on Earth. The ground trembles with small quakes every day. Steam rises from cracks in the earth, hiding pools so hot they can dissolve bone in hours. Trails that seem safe in the morning can become death traps by afternoon storms. Over the years, Yellowstone has earned a chilling reputation. People vanish here with unsettling regularity. Some falls into thermal features, their remains never recovered. Others drown in rivers, their bodies swept away under log jams and never resurfacing. A few step off the trail, lose their bearings, and are never seen again. Searchers know that in Yellowstone, even the experienced can disappear in an instant. Cases line the park's history books. A 9-year-old boy lost near a campsite, never found. A hiker whose footprints led into the snow and then stopped, as if erased. Even seasoned rangers speak in hushed tones about the missing. It has become part of Yellowstone's shadowed folklore, a counterpoint to its postcard beauty. By the time Daniel and Ethan's disappearance was added to the list, whispers had already started. "Another one?" locals said. "Another name, another mystery." The Hayes case was filed in reports, mapped on grids, and then stored among other unresolved files. Families come to Yellowstone seeking wonder, but too often they leave with heartbreak. For Lisa Hayes, those stories only deepened her conviction. "People disappear here all the time," she told journalists, "but that doesn't mean we stop looking." Yet, to rangers, the Hayes case was no longer unique. It was simply another puzzle the wilderness refused to solve. Yellowstone's secrets lie not only in its geology, but in its silence. The forests remember, the rivers keep what they take. And somewhere in those 2 million acres, Daniel and Ethan's trail had ended. Whether by accident, nature, or something darker, their names joined a list that grows longer every year, a list no one wants to be on. For every family waiting for answers, the cruelest part isn't the silence, it's the false hope. Lisa Hayes learned that lesson again and again in the years after Daniel and Ethan vanished. The first tip came only weeks after the official search ended. A backpack was spotted near the banks of the Snake River, wedged under a log. Searchers moved quickly, hearts pounding. Could it belong to Daniel or Ethan? When they dragged it out, everyone held their breath. But the bag was old, torn, its zippers rusted from years of exposure. Inside were fishing lures, but not the kind Daniel had purchased. Investigators traced it back to another missing hiker from decades earlier. The find brought answers to someone else's family, but not to the Hayeses. Months later, a hunter reported bones scattered in a clearing miles from the trailhead. Teams rushed in, careful and deliberate. The fragments looked human at first glance, fragile under the Wyoming sun. But testing revealed they belonged to elk, bleached and cracked by seasons of weather. Once again, hope collapsed. Year after year, these false leads stacked up. A shoe print found near a hot spring, a torn jacket in a tree. Each time, Lisa answered the phone with shaking hands. Each time, she prepared herself for closure, only to have it ripped away. "Every call felt like it could be the last one I'd ever need," she later said, "and every time it wasn't." The Rangers sympathized but grew cautious. Yellowstone had its share of unsolved mysteries, and resources were limited. Other hikers went missing. Other searches consumed manpower. The Hayes case became a file, thick with reports and maps, but no evidence. For Lisa and her extended family, the torment deepened. Ethan's empty bedroom remained untouched. Daniel's tools in the garage gathered dust. Each item was a reminder of a life that had paused, but never truly ended. Neighbors moved on, friends stopped asking, but the questions never left the Hayes home. In Yellowstone, the wilderness swallowed their trail, and in Colorado, despair filled the silence that followed. Time has a way of burying tragedies, even when the pain doesn't fade. 12 years passed after Daniel and Ethan stepped onto the Snake River Trail, and the world moved on. For most people, the Hayes disappearance became just another story whispered by rangers on stormy nights, or mentioned briefly in articles about Yellowstone's dangers. A case unsolved, filed away with dozens of others. The headlines faded, the TV segments stopped. New mysteries rose to take their place. But for Lisa, the silence only grew louder. Every July she drove back to the park. She walked the trail where her husband and son had last been seen. Some years, volunteers joined her. Other families who knew what it meant to search for ghosts. Other years, she was alone, her voice echoing off the trees as she called their names. The forest never answered. Ethan's friends graduated high school, went to college, started careers. Lisa received wedding invitations from children who had once played baseball with her son. Each milestone was a reminder of the future Ethan had been denied. Daniel's co-workers kept his desk untouched for a time, then finally cleared it out, storing his blueprints in an archive no one opened again. Meanwhile, Yellowstone kept its rhythm. Millions of tourists poured in every year, snapping photos of Old Faithful, camping under starlit skies. And every so often, another visitor disappeared. A hiker stepping off trail, a camper lost in sudden snow, a fisherman swept away by the river. The park gave beauty freely, but it also demanded sacrifices. Rangers began to speak of a pattern, how quickly the land could turn on those who underestimated it. The Hayes case became a footnote in the park's history of vanishings. To most, it was a closed chapter, an unsolved puzzle destined to remain that way. But to Lisa, it was unfinished. She still kept Ethan's journal by her bedside, still wore Daniel's wedding ring, still believed that one day something would surface. And then, 12 years later, it did. It was late August 2021 when a group of tourists from Illinois veered off the main trail. They weren't searching for anything unusual, just exploring, chasing the promise of a better view, away from the crowded paths. Yellowstone is vast, and curiosity often pulls visitors toward the places maps don't mark. That curiosity would change everything. The group followed a faint track, little more than a game trail pressed into the undergrowth. It wound uphill through dense pines, branches clawing at their packs. They had hiked less than a mile when one of them spotted something odd through the trees, a patch of metal glinting in the sunlight. At first they thought it was trash, maybe an old hunting blind left to rust, but as they pushed through the brush, the shape grew clearer. Tangled in moss and roots lay camping gear, rusted almost beyond recognition. A collapsed camp stove, a shredded nylon tent frame, a fishing pole snapped in half. The forest had tried to reclaim it, but it was still there, stubbornly clinging to the surface. Then came the object that froze them in place. Half buried under pine needles was a weathered notebook. Its cover was warped, the binding swollen with moisture, but the pages inside were still faintly legible. They flipped it open carefully, the paper fragile as ash. Sketches of mountains lined the first pages, valleys, ridges, outlines of peaks. Someone had taken the time to capture the very landscape they were standing in. Further in were short notes, sentences scrawled in hurried handwriting. The ink had bled, but the words were still readable enough to chill them. The tourists backed away, unsure what they had stumbled upon. It wasn't just abandoned gear. It was a record, a story left behind. By the time rangers arrived hours later, the site was cordoned off. They collected every piece of gear, bagged the notebook, and marked the area with flags. DNA testing would later confirm what the Hayeses had waited 12 years to know. The equipment belonged to Daniel and Ethan. The father and son had finally been found, or at least the first traces of them. And inside that notebook lay the final messages they'd ever write. Investigators pored over the notebook page by page. At first, it seemed like a travel journal. Sketches of river bends, quick notes about the weather, a drawing of a fish Ethan had caught. It carried the optimism of a trip still unfolding, a father and son making memories in the wild. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew shaky, uneven. One entry described Daniel twisting his ankle near the river. The words were simple. "Dad hurt." We stopped. He says it's fine. Another entry followed with darker undertones. "Storm last night. Hard to stay dry. Food low." Then came the most unsettling notes. One page read, "Heard voices at night. Thought maybe other campers, but no one there in the morning." Another sketch showed trees with dark shapes between them, hastily drawn as though the artist's hands had been trembling. The final entry was the shortest. Just 5 words, pressed so hard into the page the pen nearly tore the paper. "They're following us. Help." For investigators, the clues raised more questions than answers. Yellowstone has no shortage of strange noises, wind through the trees, animals moving at night, the echo of water in distant canyons. But why would a teenage boy describe them as voices? And who were they? The notebook ended there. No signature, no closing words, just that desperate final plea. Rangers searched the surrounding area in widening circles. They found scraps of fabric, a broken knife, and signs that the two had tried to build a fire. But there were no bodies, no clear trail. The discovery electrified the case after more than a decade of silence. The world now had a glimpse into the final days of Daniel and Ethan Hayes, injured, lost, and haunted by something or someone in the darkness. And still the most important question remained unanswered. What had truly happened in those woods? 2 days after the discovery of the notebook, search teams pushed deeper into the forest. They combed the slopes and gullies within a mile radius of the gear, fanning out in slow, methodical sweeps. The forest here was thick, the ground uneven, as if the earth itself wanted to keep secrets. Then, half a mile from the original site, one of the trackers called out. At first, it looked like nothing more than pale wood scattered among the leaves. But as they drew closer, the truth became clear. Bones, sun-bleached, weathered, and spread across the forest floor. A femur here, a rib there, small fragments half buried in moss. They were not whole skeletons, but there was no mistaking what they were. Forensics teams moved in carefully, flagging each piece, gathering them with gloved hands. Nearby, they found a rusted belt buckle and the remains of a shoe sole. Days later, DNA testing confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Daniel and Ethan Hayes. After 12 years of silence, the wilderness had finally yielded them back. The cause of death was harder to pin down. The bones carried no obvious signs of trauma, no fractures from falls, no marks suggesting an animal attack. What evidence remained suggested something slower, more relentless. Exposure, starvation, the slow fading of strength as days dragged into weeks. But the circumstances didn't fit neatly. Investigators noted that the gear found earlier still contained food packets. Some remained unopened, sealed, and intact. There were also matches and fire-starting materials that appeared barely used. And the distance between the camp and the remains raised new questions. Why had they left supplies behind? Why had they wandered further into the wilderness instead of staying put, waiting for rescue? The bones told only part of the story. The rest was left to speculation. And the picture they painted was haunting, a father and son stranded in the most unforgiving park in America, slowly consumed not by violence, but by time, hunger, and something far harder to explain. The discovery of the remains brought closure, but it also deepened the mystery. Theories multiplied in the weeks that followed, as investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths all tried to make sense of the puzzle. Why had Daniel and Ethan strayed so far off the trail? The Snake River corridor was well marked, traveled by other hikers that summer. Their chosen route should have kept them close to the water, a lifeline for anyone lost. Yet their remains were found miles away in dense forest, a place that made little sense for two people seeking rescue. Why had they left usable supplies behind? Searchers found food that could have sustained them for days, matches that could have kept them warm through freezing nights. Yet the fire ring near their last camp was shallow, almost unused. Did panic drive them from their gear? Or had something else forced them to move quickly, abandoning what they needed most? And then there was the journal. The final entries still haunted everyone who read them. The voices at night, the sense of being followed, the desperate plea for help. Rangers explained it away as fear, exhaustion, and the tricks isolation plays on the mind. Others weren't so sure. Yellowstone has always been a place of myths, of whispers about things moving unseen through the trees. To some, Ethan's words hinted at something darker than nature alone. In the end, the official report listed the deaths as accidental, likely caused by exposure and environmental conditions. It was the simplest explanation, but it didn't answer the questions that mattered most. What had they heard in those woods? Why had they left their gear? And what made them walk half a mile deeper into the wilderness only to collapse and never rise again? For the Hayes family, the answers never came. Closure was partial at best. They had bones, but not the truth. And sometimes the truth is the one thing the wilderness refuses to give. When the results came back, confirming the remains as Daniel and Ethan, Lisa Hayes wept. Not because the mystery was solved, it wasn't, but because after 12 long years, she finally had something to bury. The endless waiting was over. She could hold a service, place their names on headstones, and know that somewhere, beneath the soil, her husband and son finally rested. It wasn't the ending she had prayed for, but it was an ending she could touch, a reality she could face. Yet, even with that closure, the questions clung like shadows. Lisa often flipped through Ethan's weathered notebook, the pages fragile but preserved. She reread the sketches, the words, the final desperate line. "They're following us. Help." The notebook sat on her nightstand for months, both a comfort and a torment. It was the last piece of her son's voice, but it held more mystery than truth. For investigators, the case became a lesson in humility. Yellowstone had once again proven that even in the modern world, with satellites overhead and GPS in every pocket, it could still swallow people whole. The park was not simply a place of beauty. It was a reminder of nature's indifference, its ability to erase footprints and silence cries for help. The Hayes disappearance was added to ranger briefings, a cautionary tale told to new staff about how quickly trips can turn fatal. Visitors whispered about it too. Around campfires, hikers told the story of the father and son who vanished, of the strange notebook that hinted at voices in the dark, of the bones discovered far from their gear. Some dismissed it as panic and exhaustion. Others leaned in closer, convinced there was more, something Yellowstone wasn't telling. In the years since, the Hayes case has lingered in the park's folklore. It is a story mothers tell their children before hiking into the backcountry. Stay close, don't wander, always be prepared. It is a story rangers recall when they see tourists step too close to a riverbank or ignore warnings about storms. And it is a story that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who reads that final note. Because in Yellowstone, beauty and danger walk hand in hand. The wilderness gives wonder freely, but it also keeps its secrets, and some it never intends to share. This story was intense, but my story on the right-hand side is even more insane.